TRADCAST Express. TRADCAST Express, it's Thursday, August 15th, 2024. Matt Gaspers is the former managing editor of Catholic Family News. I say former because he just resigned the other day and has now accepted a position as managing editor at Inside the Vatican magazine under the direction of editor-in-chief Dr. Robert Moynihan. On August 13th, Dr. Moynihan conducted a live stream with Mr. Gaspers entitled Latest on Archbishop Vigano. It ended up being an almost 90-minute show, and I guess you could say that the key topic there was Gaspers responding to Carlo Maria Vigano's contention that Jorge Bergoglio, Francis, is not a valid pope. You know, I have to say I find it amazing how these recognize and resist traditionalists like Gaspers are always so insistent that the man whose teachings and laws and canonized saints they constantly sift and often reject, in other words, whom they habitually refuse submission to, must be a true and legitimate pope. They want to make sure that no matter what else you think about Francis, you can even call him anti-Christ and anti-Catholic and globalist deep state puppet and all of that, but for heaven's sake, don't you ever say he's not what he claims to be, that he's not the vicar of Christ, because then everything's going to hell. That is so insane because it has everything backwards. I know they think they're defending the papacy when they say that, but in actual fact, they're helping to destroy it because they're essentially crediting the papacy with the destruction of souls through false doctrine, false law, false or sacrilegious sacraments, false canonizations, and so on. Now, how insisting that the destruction of Catholicism was accomplished by real Catholic popes instead of anti-Catholic imposters is supposed to be a defense of the papacy is beyond me. Of course, some will say that, well, you need to have a pope. So if you say they're not popes and there haven't been popes since 1958, well, then it's not clear how you would ever get a pope again. Well, okay, the continuity of the church is a fair point to bring up. But may I just remark as an aside that if what we've seen since Vatican II, the last 6 decades of utter devastation, if that can be done by real Catholic popes, then what do we need popes for? Aren't we better off without them? Because then they're a danger to the faith, a danger to souls, and then they're shepherds not of salvation but of damnation. In fact, then what do we need a church for? If we get evil liturgies, invalid ordinations, religious liberty instead of Christ the King, ecumenism instead of proselytism, fraternity and transcendence instead of the gospel, well, of what use is such a church? Why in the world would we want that kind of a church to continue? The sooner it dies, the better. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing that we don't need a Catholic church or a pope. I'm only saying that it makes no sense to use the necessity of the church and the pope as an argument for the legitimacy of Francis or his 5 predecessors of unhappy memory. In any case, let's now get to the Moynihan-Gaspers audio. Not to the whole thing, though. That would take way too long. Let's focus on just one very specific thing, which I think is kind of the linchpin for Gaspers' position. And that is Cardinal Louis Billot's teaching on the peaceful acceptance of the Pope by the whole Church as an infallible sign of his legitimacy. Let's listen to Matt Gaspers quote and explain Cardinal Billot. And for those who want to follow along in the original video, which we've linked in the show notes, we're at the 1 hour, 9 minute, 29 second mark.
So he says, finally, whatever you still think about the possibility or impossibility of the aforementioned hypothesis, he's discussing the hypothesis of a heretical pope in his work, Tractatus de Ecclesia Christi. At least one point, he says, must be considered absolutely incontrovertible and placed firmly above any doubt whatever. The adhesion of the universal church will always, in itself, be an infallible sign. He's using the same language as Wernz Vidal. an infallible sign of the legitimacy of a determined pontiff, and therefore also of the existence of all the conditions required for the legitimacy itself. He also says, God can permit that at times a vacancy in the apostolic see be prolonged for a long time. He can also permit doubt to arise about the legitimacy of this or that election, which obviously has happened in the case of Francis. He cannot, however, permit that the whole church accept as pontiff he who is not so truly and legitimately. And ultimately, he concludes by saying, therefore, from the moment in which the Pope is accepted by the Church and united to her as the head of the body, which is what happened on March 13th, 2013, and in the days that followed, it is no longer permitted to raise doubts about a possible vice of election or a possible lack of any condition whatsoever necessary for legitimacy. For the aforementioned adhesion of the Church heals in the root all fault in the election and proves infallibly the existence of all the required conditions.
Now, Gaspers was reading from an excerpt of Cardinal Billot's tract on the Church of Christ, and he had the text of that excerpt up on the screen. But he didn't read all of it. He jumped around a bit and read only specific portions of it. And that's fine to do, as long as your selective quoting doesn't distort the context or the original meaning of the author. But in any case, here is some of the text on the screen that Gaspers didn't read out loud. Quote, "It is not necessary to look far for the proof of this, but we find it immediately in the promise and the infallible providence of Christ. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and, behold, I shall be with you all days." For the adhesion of the Church to a false pontiff would be the same as its adhesion to a false rule of faith, seeing that the Pope is the living rule of faith which the Church must follow, and which, in fact, she always follows. Unquote. That portion is something that often gets either omitted or ignored, but it's absolutely crucial because it is there that Cardinal Billot provides the explanation for why the universal peaceful adhesion of the Church is an infallible sign of the legitimacy of the Roman pontiff. And that explanation destroys Gaspers' argument, as we will see shortly. First, let me point out that Gaspers is actually begging the question, because his argument depends on the idea, which he assumes as true, that the people recognizing Francis as the legitimate pope are in fact the members of the Catholic Church. And depending on which Recognize and Resist publication you read, the church to which all these people belong and whose doctrines they profess is sometimes denounced as the New Church, Conciliar Church, Novus Ordo Church, Vatican II Church, Anti-Church, Counter-Church, False Church, etc. And the specific errors of that church are often branded anti-Catholic, diabolical, modernist, Freemasonic, and so forth. Now, perhaps not by Gaspers himself, I don't know, but certainly that is generally accepted by a lot of Recognize and Resist traditionalists who read publications like Catholic Family News. So Gaspers can't, on the one hand, say that the 1.1 billion so-called Catholics in the world are actually adhering to false, infernal Masonic doctrines, but then, when it's convenient, enlist them as an infallible witness that the head honcho publishing these garbage doctrines is in fact the Roman pontiff and vicar of Christ. Okay? I mean, you just cannot have it both ways. But that just as an aside. Now let's look at how what Cardinal Billot says that Gaspers didn't quote, though he had it on the screen, undermines his entire argument. Gaspers is saying that, per Cardinal Billot, the fact that virtually all Catholics accept Francis as Pope means he is legitimate. Okay, well, let's be more precise. Billot's argument is that the legitimacy of a particular pope is proved infallibly by the fact that the entire church adheres to him as their living rule of faith. And if the entire church could be mistaken in that, it would mean that the entire church follows a false rule of faith, which would mean that the church has defected, and that is impossible. Now, on a theoretical doctrinal level, Billot's position makes perfect sense. The entire flock cannot follow a false shepherd. Therefore, whomever the entire flock follows is necessarily the true shepherd, and that is guaranteed by Christ's promises. That makes sense. But what that would mean in the case of Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, is this. It would mean that the 1.1 billion supposed Catholics do not just recognize Francis as a true pope, but actually follow him, submit to him, and use him as their rule of what Catholics believe and practice. How many of those 1.1 billion nominal Catholics actually do that is another question, but let's grant that they do, okay, for the sake of argument. That is a problem for Gaspers because he does not want anyone to actually follow Francis, and in terms of adhering to him as the rule of faith, since Francis leads souls to hell with his false teachings and evil laws. But Cardinal Billot's point, applied to the case at hand, is that Francis would be legitimate insofar as, and precisely because, every Catholic follows him. So I have to chuckle when I see Mr. Gaspers telling us about how Cardinal Billot's position proves Francis is the Pope, when the last thing Gaspers would ever do is adhere to him as his rule of faith. As a recognize and resist traditionalist, Gaspers is constantly sitting in judgment on Francis. He's telling the world what real Catholicism is, in contrast to what Francis teaches. So, for him now to use the peaceful universal acceptance argument as infallible proof of Francis's legitimacy, when that argument is based on everyone following Francis as the rule of faith, whereas Gaspers holds that you cannot follow him as the rule of faith, is clearly a double standard. Now, along with this video live stream with Dr. Moynihan, Gaspers published a two-part article at 1 Peter 5 that also talks about this very topic. And there he does quote the full text of Cardinal Billot, including the part about the whole church following the Pope as the living rule of faith, and he appears to notice, at least somewhat, the difficulty this presents for him because he puts a comment there in a footnote. Here's what that says. It's footnote number 2 in his article. Quote, "On this point, we must remember that even the Pope is subject to the remote rule of faith, i.e., Scripture and tradition, and further, that it is lawful to resist an erring Pope, as St. Robert Bellarmine teaches." Unquote. And with these two superficial sentences in a footnote, Gaspers thinks he can resolve that pesky rule of faith problem, but he's mistaken. First, yes, the Pope is subject to Scripture and tradition, but not in the sense in which Gaspers thinks. See, Gaspers thinks that Scripture and tradition are the norm the Pope is supposed to follow, but he can deviate from that norm. But that's not what the pre-Vatican II teaching on the papacy says. Rather, the Pope is guaranteed to always follow the remote rule of faith of Scripture and tradition. He's not just supposed to do so, he actually always does do so. And if it weren't so, the papacy would not only be useless, but dangerous, because then the Pope would be little more than a Protestant pastor who is supposed to follow the Bible, but, whether he does or not is another matter, and ultimately to be determined by each pew sitter. Secondly, Gaspers' interpretation of the Pope being subject to Scripture and tradition in the sense that if he contradicts them, his teaching must be rejected by the faithful, that understanding is actually ruled out by Cardinal Billot's own words, where he says that, quote, the Pope is the living rule of faith which the Church must follow, and which, in fact, she always follows, unquote. So, if Gaspers were correct, then Cardinal Billot would have written that the Pope is the living rule of faith which the Church must follow insofar as it doesn't contradict the remote rule of faith, and which she only follows when the Pope teaches correctly. And of course, that's absurd. And lastly, as far as St. Robert Bellarmine's position on resisting an erring pope, that is one of the oldest red herrings in the book. Bellarmine was not talking about a pope teaching false doctrines in his magisterium. He didn't consider that a possibility at all. Rather, St. Robert was talking about resisting morally bad popes who give immoral commands. Now, here's what Bellarmine did say about the Church following the Pope as her shepherd and rule of faith. Quote, "The Pope is the teacher and shepherd of the whole Church. Thus, the whole Church is so bound to hear and follow him that if he would err, the whole Church would err." Unquote. And that's from the book De Romano Pontifice, on the Roman Pontiff. It's book number 4, chapter 3. And that was from the Ryan Grant translation. All of that, folks, is documented in the show notes. And with that, we have demolished Matt Gaspers' entire argument in favor of Francis's legitimacy on account of peaceful acceptance by the whole Church, as explained by Cardinal Billot. TRADCAST Express is a production of Novus Ordo Watch. Check us out at tradcast.org, and if you like what we're doing, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at novusordowatch.org/donate.